Good evening. Can we start? This is the final session of today's conference, and it is meant to be some kind of a concluding session. We do not have prepared papers to present. Instead, it's supposed to be a roundtable discussion, some kind of brainstorming about the prospects for Europe, with particular reference to the concept of solidarity and inclusive growth. I do not have to introduce the speakers because they've already been introduced in previous panels. I'm afraid that we are asking our invited speakers to do a double act, or at least some of them. So we overexploit you, and our apologies for that. Let me start with a few words about the state we are in today in Europe, starting with a very brief balance sheet of what happened in previous years and what the crisis consists of in Europe today. We all know that, so I will start with sort of the general picture and then give the floor to my fellow panelists. Of course, we all know that Europe is in deep trouble in recent years. This is undoubtedly the worst economic crisis that Europe has experienced since the end of the Second World War, and certainly the worst crisis of European integration since the very beginning in the 1950s. It is a crisis that is largely, but not exclusively, economic in nature. And it is concentrated on the Eurozone, although the crisis extends beyond the Eurozone and also goes much deeper. What does the crisis consist of? What do we mean by the word crisis? First of all, let me remind you, let me go through very quickly, sort of to put the European crisis in a nutshell. Remember that real GDP for the Eurozone as a whole of 2007 will not be recovered before the end of 2015, which means that we have in the title the possibility of a lost decade, but we already have a lost decade behind us. Unemployment has risen dramatically during the crisis, average for the Eurozone as a whole. The unemployment rate is in double-digit figures, average for the countries of the Eurozone. And youth unemployment has hit the stratosphere in some parts of Europe, which suggests that on top of a lost decade, we are likely to have a lost generation as well in parts of Europe. And that is not all. Economic stagnation has been accompanied by growing economic divergence between countries and within countries. In other words, while, let me refer to the two extremes, while Greece at one end of the spectrum has already lost 25% of its GDP, for a country like Germany, which has not done very well, but still, crisis is something terrible that happens to others. And if you have that kind of economic divergence within the European Union, it of course becomes very difficult to reach common policies to deal with the problem. Economic divergence has also been accompanied by the rise of nationalism in most European countries, and also by the rise of anti-systemic parties that are challenging the status quo. I'm not necessarily saying that the status quo is good or bad, but we have the rise of anti-systemic parties. In other words, the center, in political terms, is being squeezed in virtually every European country, and the extremes are growing, both from the right and from the left. Eurosceptic parties have grown, have gathered strength, and support for European integration has hit a historical low. So this is perhaps the European crisis in a nutshell. Now, there has been, I've already talked about economic divergence, but it's not only economic divergence. Europe has been divided. It has been divided between creditor and debtor countries, while income inequalities have been growing in the majority of European countries during the crisis. So there is a division, and the division takes also a different form. It's not only a division between creditors and debtors, between North and South, but there is also another kind which is largely coincides or with the division between North and South. There is an ideological and political division as to how you deal with the crisis. There are those who believe that in response to the crisis, you put the emphasis on fiscal consolidation and structural reform as the way out of the crisis. I have to simplify, of course. This is the stance adopted mostly by people who are on the right side of the political spectrum and who find themselves mostly, largely, in creditor countries. And there's the other group of not only economists but also policymakers who think that in addition perhaps to structural reform and fiscal consolidation, or to put it differently, Europe needs to take a more active stance in terms of both fiscal and monetary policy. Those who have been arguing in favor of structural reform and austerity are the ones we've been calling the shots until now, because they represent the creditor countries, and the creditor countries in a crisis of debt have the final word, or have had the final word until now. They've been arguing that with structural reform and fiscal consolidation, Europe will become again fit for purpose, or more competitive and fit for globalization. The problem, however, is that economic recovery is constantly being put off year after year. So after already a lost decade, remember that Europe compares very unfavorably in terms of its macroeconomic performance with the United States and also recently with the United Kingdom. Europe is today flirting with deflation. Growth remains very low, fragile, and very uneven inside the Eurozone. Unemployment is very high, and there is no prospect of creating many jobs in the future to deal with the problem of unemployment. Public debt today is on average much higher as a percentage of GDP than it used to be before the outbreak of the crisis. Private debt is very high, and banks are still trying to deleverage, which means that they're not providing sufficient liquidity that could finance investment and recovery. So here we are today. The prospects at the present moment look rather gloomy, and my guess is that, and that would be my last word as an introduction, is that unless Europe recovers economically soon, the political and social consequences of prolonged stagnation will be increasingly difficult to manage, especially in the more vulnerable countries. So to use a phrase of a former US president who was not to my liking, but I like the phrase, you ain't seen nothing yet in Europe. So if you think you have seen the worst, you may have to change your mind. So having said that, which is to cheer you up, I will give the floor to David Rueda, who perhaps will succeed in cheering us up.
I'm afraid that's not completely going to be the case. I think that we probably have distributed sort of the speakers for this last session from sort of the least optimistic to the more optimistic, or that's the hope. So I'm going to pick up on three themes that Lucas has already sort of talked about, but I'm afraid that my assessment is going to be as gloomy as it has been already. This is really sort of a set of remarks about the state we're in, and I guess that sort of my thoughts are in terms of the crisis, and my thoughts are related to three possible solutions, or have been presented as three possible solutions for the state we're in, and one of the consequences, and they're all things that Lucas has mentioned already. I would separate austerity and structural reforms into two of the sort of the possible macroeconomic solutions to the crisis. And again, sort of as before, my view of these two possible solutions is quite pessimistic. Austerity comes out of a concern about debt, public, as we saw, for example, in one of the talks that looked at public debt in Greece, but also private. I mean, in the Mediterranean countries, the case of Spain, for example, is one in which before 2008 there isn't a big public debt problem. There is a private debt problem, and then that debt is made public, and that then requires austerity. I'm convinced by sort of a neo-Keynesian sort of interpretation of what austerity does and it does not do. It is unclear to me why austerity, how austerity is supposed to solve a crisis. There may be good long-term consequences to austerity, but how or why those would resolve the problems that some countries have in terms of the crisis seems very unclear to me. It's also clearly failed in most countries that have practiced it. Lucas mentioned the UK as a possible case proving the success of austerity, but there is quite a bit of doubt that that is in fact a good case for an outcome that is positive, both because the austerity is not completely clear, but also because the degree of growth has been accompanied by a decrease in terms, an increase in poverty, and an increase in low-paying work. So again, sort of not a clear outcome. It also reminds me of Panos' presentation, in which he went through a set of sort of successful public policy steps being taken by the Greek government in the crisis to then look at the outcomes and the economic outcomes in terms of unemployment and debt and growth are all negative. So we have a government that arguably has done these things relatively successfully, and still the economic outcome is very negative. Structural reforms, again, things like the labor market reforms that we have talked about today, but also something like internal devaluation. Even if there is a justification for these policies in good times, or even if there are justifications for these policies as long-term solutions to the clear problems that exist in some of these countries, again, I find it very difficult to understand why this would be considered a good policy to promote in the middle of a crisis. There is very little research that I have seen that proves that sort of more flexible labor markets, for example, are more successful in promoting economic growth than less flexible labor markets, particularly when you look at some continental European countries and leave some of the Mediterranean ones aside. And again, there is, even if there is this justification for long-term sort of competitiveness being improved by these structural changes, their immediate effects in terms of combating the crisis and sort of getting us out of this almost lost decade already seem very questionable. So those are the two solutions that I don't find particularly attractive or convincing. There is a third one that I'll talk about in a second, which has to essentially do with European redistribution in terms of, again, sort of talking about the European side of this idea that since European integration means a degree of fiscal federalism, that then there would be sort of a redistribution side to it, and this is also related to part of what Gunther was talking about in his presentation. But I'll just say that the immediate effect of these two possible solutions, austerity and structural reforms, as Lucas was saying, has been this division in Europe. But I would say, I would put sort of a slightly sort of different twist in terms of this division, because it very much reminds me of sort of dualization at a European level. Somehow, it is true that we have sort of the North and the South, we have the rich and the poor, but Europe is becoming something very close to sort of an insider-outsider international sort of setup, in which we do have sort of insiders in Europe that are successful, protected, and then a set of outsiders, sort of, or nations in which outsiderness is promoted, and then sort of flexibility and low pay wages and sort of less than optimal sort of protection is promoted as the solution for sort of the flexibility needed by sort of the entire entity. So there is that sort of, again, sort of, we are all aware of the consequences of dualization of labor markets at an internal level, at the domestic level. We have experienced it in the Mediterranean countries, in Spain and Greece. They're not very pretty. And in some ways, sort of the European level is becoming sort of a dualized sort of labor market, or a dualized set of political economies. So the final idea is this European redistribution. I mean, again, sort of one of the things that I find convincing is the idea that if Europe is to succeed, then if a degree of fiscal redistribution within Europe has to take place. And I think that this is also how I take some of the ideas that Gunther was talking about, even if they in effect require no straight redistribution, but somehow disguising this redistribution as loans or sort of investment spending. But essentially, sort of, again, sort of is comparing sort of the US case to Europe, right? Sort of if it is difficult for me to imagine Europe surviving as a sort of a political and economic entity unless a degree of sort of fiscal redistribution takes place between the rich and the poor, even if the rich and the poor are different at different times, as again sort of a buffer against economic shocks. Is there the political willingness to promote that? I don't see it. I don't see this sort of a public opinion behind this idea of a redistributive European enterprise. I don't see either the rhetoric at the elite level or a public opinion sort of consciousness that we're all in this together, that we share an identity, and that therefore sort of somehow this sort of European identity means that sort of in bad times, sort of those who are better off contribute to those who are worse off. So I must sort of conclude my brief remarks by again sort of giving not a terribly sort of optimistic set of thoughts.
Thank you very much. Now I move to my extreme right, which is Panos.
I got this title as well. Good.
He's left. Yeah, but it's all subjective.
Right. First of all, several of the things that I'm going to say have already been covered by Lucas and David. And let me look at them at from a slightly different angle. First of all, let's look at the long view. The whole process of European integration has two characteristics. One is that it was a gradual process, and secondly, it was an elitist project. We didn't have the huge demonstrations, United Europe or anything like this. It was promoted by other means. The benefits have been enormous, either in terms of peace. We never had such a long period of peace in Europe. Nowadays, we are just killing itself sometimes in football grounds, but the casualties are substantially smaller than the ones that traditionally we had, let's say, in wars that were ravaging the continent, in terms of stability, democracy, growth, and improvement in the living standards. The creation of the monetary union was supposed to be the jewel of the crown of this whole process. It has backfired significantly. The union perhaps is in, I would even dare saying imminent, not because of recent developments in Greece, but because of the whole architecture of the monetary union on an imminent danger of collapse. And if something like this happens, I have the feeling that we will experience the breakup of the European Union, not only of the monetary union. Was monetary union a badly designed project? I think it was. This was something that was discussed widely at the time of the creation of the monetary union. In economics, there is this theory of optimal currency areas. More or less, this means that I can have common monetary policy with somebody else if we have the same business cycle. Otherwise, at the time that I will need low interest rate, the other person, the other country, will need high interest rates and vice versa. And we knew even from that time that the euro area was not an optimal currency area. The expectation at that time, it was, let's say, by using some substitute of a common policy, let's say, some common rules in the forms of the famous Maastricht criteria and so on, we will end up in some sort of a situation where, the stability and growth pact, I mean, we will be, let's say, that after some years we would move to the policy that would be essential. What is this policy that is essential? If we look at history again, we can see that there are several attempts at monetary union. The only ones that were successful were the ones that were transforming themselves into some form of fiscal union. And in fact, in several instances, it was the fiscal union that was coming before the monetary union. The monetary union was following. Now, there is a realization that something like this is essential in the European Union. However, we must be very clear about it. Fiscal union effectively requires some kind of state formation. It means transfer of power, substantial transfer of power from the national authorities to some supranational body. I must admit that there are several elements of the fiscal union that are in place. For instance, the banking union is a step in this direction. The fiscal compact is something that is moving in this direction. The European semester and the common surveillance mechanism, 2-pack, 6-pack, and so on, are also movements in this direction. However, there is no discussion for two very important elements. One is, let's say, a larger EU budget and the form of enhanced economic governance for Brussels, as I mentioned before, let alone about debt mutualization. And even these processes are primarily at the moment intergovernmental. They are not European processes. Now, in order to move into the direction of more Europe, state formation and so on, this requires some sort of popular support. Popular support in this direction, as David mentioned before, and as the elections of the European Parliament demonstrate very vividly, as Lucas pointed out, they point to exactly the opposite direction. The strengthened parties were only Eurosceptic parties in almost all countries of the European Union. From this point of view, the attitude of several European governments does not help. We have seen it in this country, but you can see it in almost every single European country that comes to my mind. Whenever something good is happening, the national government is trying to appropriate it. Whenever there are necessary changes that have to be implemented, I gave you the example of, for instance, pension reform here in Greece, the government says, oh, we never wanted to implement it, but it was this bloody Brussels that forced us to go in this direction. This does not definitely create, let's say, some sort of climate conducive for reforming the right direction. Now, the current crisis, we saw a sharp drop in output and increase in unemployment, more in some countries than in others. But the main problem is that capitalism is a system that is full of crises. Now, the problem that we have here is that after the end of the crisis, what we see is anemic growth, still high debt, very high debt in several countries, and also deflation. Unemployment remains very high, especially among the youth, and therefore, from this point of view, if I go to the basic question that we were asked there is indeed an imminent danger for a lost decade with very serious political as well as economic consequences, which may threaten even the very European integration project itself. In other words, we need growth, full stop. Now, what can be done? As I mentioned before, policies to restore growth, in my opinion, they are of paramount importance. At the moment, we expect too many things from the European Central Bank. For instance, we are discussing all the time about quantitative easing and the like. We must take into account that according to the constitution of the European Central Bank, they cannot do these things. I have the feeling that since necessity is the mother of invention, they will do it in the end. However, we cannot anticipate from monetary policy to deliver more than they can deliver. At some time, we need something on the side of the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy now, this initiative cannot come from countries like Greece. We are operating on a shoestring, we all know that. There are countries that have fiscal space to do it, but they refuse to do it. Germany is the name of the country. However, the main thing, in my opinion, can come primarily from European initiatives, like the Juncker initiatives, but in a far larger scale. This has long-term consequences as well, to which I will return in a moment. In the meantime, we definitely need mechanisms that will play this role of common fiscal policy that I mentioned before. In my opinion, and this was something that Günther mentioned in his talk earlier on, sooner or later, in the next few years, if we do not have any very adverse effects, we will see some form of common European unemployment insurance policy. This is not a permanent transfer mechanism. For instance, if this mechanism was in place in the first years of the creation of the euro, most probably the transfers would have flown from the countries that had high growth rates, Greece, Ireland, etc., to Germany, that was still languishing after the cost of unification and so on. However, this mechanism, in my opinion, will come into play very quickly. Now, if we move to the medium to the long term, then we must take into account some factors that are also important. They do not appear very often in the public discourse. I mentioned before that Greece is an aging country. Greece is not unique. Europe is an aging country. At some time, we must have, let's say, some sort of serious discussion about what sort of immigration policy that we would like to favor. Some countries do it, some others do not. But most importantly, and from this point of view, I have the feeling that I will agree 100% with our German friends, we need promotion of productivity and enhancing policies, be it in infrastructure, pan-European networks, research and development, training, market liberalization, and all this kind of stuff. Therefore, it is hard to underplay the importance of structural reforms in a medium to long-term perspective. We need, let's say, some sort of a higher growth to finance somehow this extra cost of this aging society that I mentioned before. Now, within this framework that I presented so far, and taking into account the difficulties facing the peripheral countries, some kind of cross-country solidaristic policies, I think that they are essential, both for political and for economic reasons, not only in this form that it is now. Take, let's say, this extra loan so that you do not get bankrupt and you have, let's say, these draconian measures on top. On the second part of the question that was there, and taking into account that there is very limited labor mobility, as well as several political constraints, I think that most probably policies aiming to promote social inclusion within countries will remain in the foreseeable future national rather than European. So my overall assessment is that cautiously pessimistic, but I hope that the prevailing thing in the end, it will be the cautiously and not the pessimistic. Thank you very much.
Fine. Thank you. I suppose the crisis is not only limited to the crisis of the Eurozone. We know that some of the problems we've been facing in Europe go much deeper and predate the crisis. One of the secular trends that predates the crisis is the increasing number of what I and many other people call the losers in our societies. People who see themselves as losing out of this long economic transformation, and which is manifested, among other things, through growing inequalities within countries. So Wim will talk to us, among other things, about inequalities.
That's what you hope. I said this afternoon that I'm not a policy maker nor a policy analyst, so I have to be very careful about what I say about Europe and the next decade. And indeed, you mentioned longer-term trends. So let me mention one trend. In the Dutch income distribution, the lower half is at the same level as they were in 1977. So they haven't made any progress in real terms for 35 years. I think that brings attention to that northern countries, many of them have been practicing wage restraint. That was part of what the Germans did. Also France had practiced that to some extent earlier, not necessarily now, compared to productivity growth. And some of these countries have pretty high rates of youth unemployment as well. Not as high as in Spain, but if you look at, you should look at the youth unemployment problem per capita of the youth population, much better than per capita of the labor force participation, and then it looks a lot different. But the main point, so there's something going on in the north that may actually have a relationship to stagnating investment in many of these countries, and maybe the flip side of that is all these investments that have been done in Spain and other countries, which are now called, that's the reason now the northern countries are called creditor countries and the other ones are debtor countries, has to do something with financial flows that might have been partly made possible by wage restraint in the north. So in my view, there is actually a lot of integration. We all know that a number of countries from the successive rounds of access to the Union have changed beyond recognition, and even over the last 10 years many of the countries in Eastern Europe have changed, I think, very considerably. So there is something that the European Union has managed to accomplish, and I think they should sell that, or the countries involved should sell that much more than they do. And maybe some of their advantages or their progress has to do not with structural reform. I was waiting for the word all day, but maybe it has been mentioned in Greek today. I couldn't, because that's the buzzword for the ECB and other policymakers. But maybe it's more about elite behavior and employer behavior. Part of the explanation of things going on in northern countries rests firmly on the behavior of employers. In the Netherlands, we wouldn't have collective agreements if the employers didn't want that, because unions have way too small density of their membership. It's the employers, they have large density of their membership, not in all the countries, so that's very different in the UK, but in Denmark, in Sweden, in Finland, in the Netherlands, and it's breaking down gradually in Germany, but also there. So that kind of behavior of how an elite behaves might be more important for structural reform than well, in my view, rather stupid things about flexible contracts, etc. If you look at the current employment population ratio in Europe, it's not different from the US. So in terms of hiring, we don't have a problem. We have a problem of putting hours into these jobs. So we include a lot of part-time jobs in the count that they don't have in the US. Now that brings me to another issue. The integration, we might come to realize, is a much taller order than we might have expected. If you look at the US, between the range of employment to population ratios over the 50 states there is as wide as in Europe. There's a 20 percentage point difference in employment rates over these states, and that's unchanged. It was there in 1980. It's even a bit bigger now, but that may be because of the crisis. So they have the same, in a sense they could say we have the same problem as Europe, but it's not a salient problem there. Nobody talks about it, and here we all want the same outcome. We have EU 2020. Each country likes to have 75% employment rate in 2020. Well, I think that's more than a policy fantasy. That's also what the population wants. And that demands different workings of the labor market. So therefore you might need structural reform in that sense to cater to those preferences. So there's one thing that, in that sense, it's a much taller order than the Americans have, in the sense, so they've come to live with that. We can't live with such differences, and for good reason. We are all countries with a history. A number of countries, particularly, again, the smaller countries in the north, they have been operating like small export-oriented countries for most of their life, or for most of, well, maybe for most of their life as former countries. So they have a different mindset in that respect. Maybe they have to adapt to the situation that we're now all part of a bigger economy, but they have a different economic history in that sense. But also we have different political history. So we have strong says at the national level, which don't exist to that extent in the US. So that adds to the tall order, I would say, that makes it so much more difficult. And I think one of the things that we have to discuss for the future is also, so I was at a discussion at the European Commission, at the ECFIN, so that's the hardcore of the Commission, and I think the idea is that in the end all countries will be the same. Will have the same outcome. Well, if you look at a currency union like Italy or the UK or Germany since unification, there are huge differences, and there are regions that are left behind through specialization and other things, and we have to ask ourselves how we can prevent that in the long run for Europe. So I think we need to have a kind of plan for the year 2040 or something, or 2030, what the union will look like, also with that kind of detail. And I think the countries that have really changed as a result of access to the union, they should speak out more loudly in favor of going on. And also I think their populations are much more still in favor of continued integration. For the other ones, I think then you need to be a political specialist. I don't know how this will turn out in the northern countries. That's the difficult thing, I think. But they need, and I think they're very well aware that they're integrated into the rest. So they've been exporting for ages. They have been recently exporting capital to these other countries, and they know very well. But that's not a general knowledge for the public. But I think the countries themselves are very well aware, and they should speak out what the consequences of that are.
Thank you. So our last chance for having a cheerful message is from Germany. So, Günther, you have the floor.
I directly respond to the German challenge. This reminds me to an article of The Economist in May 2010, where The Economist was admiring the German Jobwunder and asking how do we solve the euro crisis, and The Economist, a British journal, no, not a German one, that the Greek should behave a little bit more than the Germans, that would solve the euro crisis. And I think this is a completely stupid statement, because it's not a matter of convergence of behavior, but it's a matter of conversions, upgrading of institutions. Not people are stupid, but institutions are stupid, to put it in a rough way. And we do not really like conversions as we do not like conversions of the weather we mentioned in the morning, or of the food, or of yesterday evening I walked around the corners of the hotel, this lively city. You do not find this in public places. You do not find normally in German cities. But I like this public life, and this is a contrast to that. In the evening, people are looking Euro television or the Euro Championship, and the streets are empty. So, it's a matter of institutions, and how do we come up to upgrade institutions that are building a political union, which is a social union of Europe, which is still missing. And to reflect about this, you allowed me that to be a bit general, and I start with a very general remark on some normative elements of a European social union, which consist of a lively participatory democracy with thriving diversity, a dynamic and wealth economy, and generous welfare system on the basis of fair risk sharing. This is, in my view, the three elements: democracy, participatory democracy, lively on different levels, and a thriving economic but also generous welfare state on the basis of fair risk sharing. If you look back in the long history, you always find that risk sharing and the invention of social security and social protection institutions were at the beginning, not at the end, of economic thriving development. There's a very nice book by Peter Bernstein, Against the God, who went back to the history, finding that social innovation in terms of risk management, fair risk management, is a starting point. And so we have to find something like this for the social union in Europe. And what have we now? We have a tendency, to put it very bluntly, in terms of democracy, degenerating into plutocracy, market economy degenerating into a gambling casino, and the welfare state into a poorhouse. And I never understood, I'm not a pure economist, especially not a financial economist, but I never really understood why investment banks are called investment banks. Because as I understand, investment banks are gambling, more or less, but not really investing and providing credits for small and medium enterprises into risky investment. There is no really risk sharing in this way. I wonder really, we have all the degeneration of the words and of the concepts here. I come from a rural area in the south of Germany, where the Sparkassen played a really very important role to bring up the economy, the small economy in the rural areas, and to provide the structural change from the agricultural to a thriving industrial and manufacturing area. So what can we do? Three remarks with respect to these three items: democracy, market economy, and welfare state. I am a little bit speculative, and you allowed me to do this, and maybe even a little provocative. Democracy on the European level. I think we should really not forget today or tomorrow, not in 10 or 15 years, to start with the reshaping of the democratic structure of the European Union. At the moment, we have 4 presidents, we have 3 councils, and we have a mess of institutions. Nobody has really a transparent view. But the fact is that we do not have a real division of the powers, of the executive powers and the legislative power. The European Parliament has even not the right of initiative, legislative initiatives. This is lying in the Commission. This is absurd. In order, the budgetary sovereignty should be, especially among the European Parliament. And maybe also we have some changes in terms of reshaping the lot of presidencies and things like that. And we need also urgently, in my view, a second chamber where the countries, the member states are represented according to their weight. So kind of second chambers, a real parliament with legislative power, and the second chamber where the countries are represented. So this would be a direction. Of course, there are other ideas, but we have to start immediately this discussion, and without this kind of democratic legitimation, we cannot make a real step forward to a European political and social union. With respect to the market economy, the true issue is, in my view, really investment. We have, especially even in Germany, that's a German problem at the moment, both in terms of public investment and private investment. Germany is lagging behind most member states at the moment. Why? To some extent, because we have not the right framework in terms of financing investment, private investments, and the public state is empty, poor, and is proud in Germany, for instance, of a zero budget. We have now a zero budget, but essentially due to the fact that the interest rate for government credits are even negative in Germany. And this is crazy in my view. Capital is enough around. There's money, capital enough to invest, but the problem is there are no real channels to get this into real investments, especially at the European level. I think we need an urgent, huge investment program in European infrastructure, and especially in energy, transport, and information and communication technology. The Juncker plan now is going in the right direction, but I do not really believe, because there's no fresh money. That's just kind of mechanical rearrangement. And I'm skeptic about this. And the most urgent thing, in my view, is that we have to get really a European banking union, which we started to implement, but essential elements are still missing. And we have to go forward in terms of, in this respect, that the banks become, again, not gambling institutions, but institutions whose work and whose task is to channel this prosperity and the wealth into real new investment, especially at the local, regional level. With respect to the welfare state, most important is the youth unemployment, I think. And you have also to consider that the cost of youth not in employment, neither in employment nor in education or training, has been calculated by the Dublin Foundation in Ireland to be per year 163 billion euro, which is 1.3% of GDP. In Greece is even 4.3% of GDP, the cost of youth not in employment, not in education and training. This shows you that investing into youth, into the future, would also tremendously save costs, which we have in the medium and long term. And now the question is, we have the European the Youth Guarantee initiative with 6 billion euro, which is ridiculous in a way. There comes a big speculation. I think the big issue is, how can Europe build up a genuine fiscal capacity, for instance, then to finance this kind of solidaric European employment and insurance fund, which we would need for redistribution. How can we build up, again, funds which are able to redistribute ex ante, not ex post? I think the work by Thomas Piketty, you all know, is quite important to show this trend of inequality. But I think there's limited effectiveness of his proposal of a wealth tax, because this is ex post, an ex ante way to build up funds. I'm talking now at the European level. It could also be at the national level. Would be that Europe starts with developing a sovereign wealth fund by issuing Eurobonds, which means when with the Eurobonds, they are buying equities on the global capital market. With the equities on the global equity market, Europe could then develop a fund which is in the public authority and belongs to all the European people, with which the European people can identify. And with this fund, one could then start up to build up this kind of social security and employment security funds which we need for investment into a European youth guarantee. And I leave it with this speculative idea, which you can respond to. Okay.
Thank you. I suppose, I mean, listening to all of you and also listening to myself, there is, what we are describing in a sense, is a growing disconnect between economic integration and political integration in Europe. I mean, you said that if you take the United States, disparities in terms of labor participation rates are as big between the states of the US as they are within the European Union. But the difference is that the European Union does not have the institutions to deal with it, and does not even have, it's more than that. In order to have institutions, you need either to create legitimacy or find ways to create the legitimacy. And what is interesting is that because of the crisis, we have become even less able to deal with the problems because of growing divergence. If the trends are very different in individual countries, then it becomes extremely difficult to agree on anything. And it's not only divergence, there's something else that has gone badly wrong in recent years. And this is trust. There is very little trust between governments and between citizens. I mean, if you think, it's interesting that in recent years we have seen the return of national stereotypes in the popular press all over. Things that we thought we had forgotten for decades, they are back. They are the stereotypes of what is a German, of what is a Greek, of what is an Italian, and so on. And those stereotypes are exchanged across borders. And that makes it extremely difficult then to agree or to trust each other. Because one of the problems, I suppose, today is that Germany is not willing to agree on a more active fiscal or monetary policy because it's not sure that the French will deliver on reforms. And the French argue that they are not able and willing to deliver on reforms as long as the fiscal and the monetary context is so restricted. And it becomes, you know, a catch-22 situation. Any views on that? How does one restore trust in Europe? Any bright ideas?
Got a little point which is not so directly related to your question, but in a certain way, yes. We, Alberto, mentioned the differences of the labor markets of the European member states. And one thing is to develop trust, that we have to develop, in a way, better qualitative indicators for the benchmarks we are setting, and then monitoring and exchanging benchmarking competition. employment rate, for instance. It's just to measure the employment rate, 75%, it's ridiculous because it doesn't tell anything about the quality of the jobs, about the what kind of jobs these are, and in particular, we are moving more and more in the labor market, which is very dynamic, where people over the life course move from one position to another status, from part-time to full-time, combining education and training with part-time work, and having a sabbatical, going in parental leave, or when the older parents get ill and they have to take care for their elderly person. We need, over the life course, tremendous lot of transition opportunities, which have to be secured by social protection, of course. And if you look, for instance, at the employment rate of Sweden, the nominal employment rate in Sweden, the nominal in terms of the counting of the European Commission is one of the highest. I think it's 78% or even already 80%. But the effective employment rate, which means the employment rate of people who are during a week really at the workplace, not really at the workplace, as I'm sitting here, is about 64%. So we have a difference of the effective employment rate and the nominal employment rate of almost 20 percentage points. Who are these people, these 20%? Some are, of course, ill, okay, fine, but not all. Some are on educational leave, some are on parental leave. Some are on voluntary sabbaticals, things like that. And so that makes Europe, if Europe develops benchmarking indicators which are really in qualitative terms, in terms of what we in methodological terms are not valid. So this is not creating trust.
Perhaps just one comment, if I may. I mean, listening to your statistic in Sweden, it reminds me of that famous phrase of a British politician who said, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics.
Well, some of these figures are available. It's more about the discourse. So one question that I have, when was this trust loss? I think there was trust enough around 2005. Everybody was trusting that Spain would grow into the sky, whatever. So maybe I would like that, but that's maybe a question to you, when this trust actually got lost. And my feeling is that it got lost when they took the wrong turn in 2011, and that all these countries started to change their structure indeed to and their budget deficit and their spending, and we're starting these reforms which are quite unclear what they mean for the population, and are mistrusted, I think, in many cases between the government and the population. That may be a major thing. At the same time, there's the long-run issue which Günther mentioned, that are losers, and we've never accepted, I think, in the European discourse that there might be people who lose from that integration, and that we might have to take care of that loss. So maybe that's one of the things that we have to concede as well in the discourse, that it's not, certainly not in the short run, a gain for everybody. And that we should try to find ways to share that risk to some extent, without losing the incentive to people to get to like it in the end. But that's in the long run.
Not really. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at data on sort of political trust and or sort of trust in institutions. It's clearly the case that it probably has to do with economic hardship, and that we are observing both a lack of trust in the European project, but also a lack of trust in domestic institutions and mainstream political parties. So I think that certainly there is some sort of economic structural sort of factor and underlying that. But I mean, I think that the task ahead was sort of hard enough when we were just talking about fiscal integration and the possibility of unemployment insurance, and then I saw myself sort of agreeing with Wimmer when he was talking about corporatism, and then I thought, then sort of does this mean that then sort of we need to develop some sort of Southern European corporatism in which employers are like, which makes the task even harder. So again, sort of that doesn't sort of support an optimistic view of where we're going.
We have a few questions.
If we look at the literature on social capital in particular, there is a result that it is very clear, even though we have many important difficulties in measuring social capital, it is something that is built up gradually. If it is destroyed, it is very difficult to reconstruct it somehow later on. I'm very much afraid that we are in a situation like this. Therefore, yet another element of optimism. Now, regarding welcome the point. Regarding this question of how we can move in this direction, there is no question that you need some form of an identity. Otherwise, all these things we are discussing about further political integration and the like, they will be null and void. I must admit that there were several things that were implemented in past decades, small things, from Erasmus program up to Schengen that we do not have to queue in the airports. Several things like that, that they were moving in the right direction, showing people, they say that there is something common here, there is some benefit, etc., that is visible and tangible. Something that was missing that would promote quite a lot identity is the question of mobility. I mean physical mobility, labor mobility and the like. After so many decades, and for reasons that are not immediately obvious, European labor market is very fragmented. Labor mobility is very limited. I do not know, therefore, from this point of view either. Finally, on the question that you were asking about France and Germany, for instance, reforms in exchange for laxer policies and so on. One of the ideas that has been discussed in recent years at high level in Europe and so on, it was to give money in exchange for structural reforms. I think that it came from your council, actually, that you were participating there. This, in theory, is a good idea. However, once they started putting various strings there, the idea was abandoned. First of all, they said that, okay, in order to have something like this, we must have structural reforms that have very considerable cross-country externalities. How many reforms can you think like that? Then they were saying initially it was, let's say, just to give grants, then it was, let's say, loans on concessional terms or something like this. In the end of the day, even the strongest supporters of this idea abandoned the whole thing. Yet another element of optimism. Yep.
Wanted to mention something about this social capital issue. I mean, I think in some ways the issue is not trust in general, right? So I think that we're observing in Europe the increasing sort of division of sort of in-group and out-group sort of solidarity, and that's sort of so that it won't be new or sort of or difficult for people to think when you think about UKIP in the UK or other political options. It is not sort of domestic solidarity or solidarity with people like yourself that is questioned, right? So it's this development of in-group versus out-group. And in here I can sort of point out to some work that I'm doing, particularly about support for redistribution, in which sort of sharing an identity with the poor turns out to be very important in the rich or the affluent support for redistribution. And this is sort of one of the things that sort of has been mentioned in terms of homogeneous societies having sort of generous redistribution systems and heterogeneous societies not having. So this is one of the issues with economic crisis, that it has made this kind of division between us and them within Europe sort of more relevant to this kind of support for fiscal integration, redistribution that we all think is quite important for the project to be successful in the long term.
Very few questions. I know it's already 8:30, but I see you're all keen to carry on, so we'll take a few questions. Mr. Monasteriotis, and then
Thank you. I will try for a change to instill some optimism. I would like to challenge this view that the Eurozone hasn't worked and it failed and it keeps on failing us and everything. And let me qualify that. So in the good years of the Eurozone, we saw some remarkable convergence, both in terms of income convergence across the Eurozone and the Eurozone South. Also, we saw a remarkable decline in interest rates, inflation rates, even structural reforms, reconstruction in some places, and places that we don't see as very vibrant, even, you know, Spain that was growing quite fast. And they also managed to weather all the deindustrialization that happened with all the industry that went to the east. You wouldn't even see it, you know, you wouldn't even notice. So there were very, very successful performances. Even in the crisis, take Greece aside, you know, Latvia went into the crisis and came out within a year or two. Portugal and Spain and Ireland are growing, but they're not the worst performers in the Eurozone today. Bulgaria, which has a peg, and it is a very underdeveloped, you know, the poorest country in the European Union, it has a peg to the euro, and still they managed to survive. They didn't even need IMF assistance or anything. So there are very successful examples, and still, even, you know, for the bottom 50% of the Dutch people, I think they're much better off in terms of consumption levels today. I take the point that in terms of real incomes they're not, but I'm pretty sure they have their iPhones, the PlayStations, the, you know, more modern cars and everything. So the European Union, as Panos mentioned, you know, it managed to bring stability and prosperity to Europe. We don't have the wars that we had in the beginning of the 20th century, and it managed to raise living standards for all. And in the last decade, it managed to bring the South much closer to the North. What it didn't do was to instill the political effectiveness of policy in the South. And I'm very much focusing on the management of the capital flows, because we see the current account deficits growing in the South, but the equivalent of that is a huge inflow of capital in the South. Now, as it happened, it led to house bubbles in Spain, bloated public sector in Greece, or consumerism in general, and other things, you know, bloated banking systems in Cyprus, perhaps in Latvia, in Ireland. So the problem is not, if you want, even the lack of structural reforms or the asymmetry of the Eurozone as such. The problem is that we didn't have a common mechanism that would incentivize the capital flows, the management of the capital flows towards productive investment, towards upgrading the export capacity of countries like Greece and so forth. And I think this is the challenge we should be addressing. I think that's a more optimistic message. It is not that we have a basket case institutional architecture. I think it has worked well, it can work well. We just need to fix the problems as long as we identify them correctly, fix them and move on.
Professor Ioannidis. No? Oh, sorry, and then you. Okay, you start.
I see this session was partly titled The Challenge of Inclusive Growth. And putting austerity aside for 1 minute, I wonder if the panel would consider a major investment program that invested in people to increase productivity. There are large sections of society which have low levels of human and social capital. And if they agree that that's a potentially good way of moving forward, how would they design such a investment program?
Thank you. And Professor Ioannidis.
Sorry. Now, talking about trust, I would argue that the basic challenge for the European Union is first and foremost to restore trust between Paris and Berlin, France and Germany. That's the indispensable condition for forging ahead, for completing economic and monetary union. I'm sure everybody knows that EMU was a Franco-German project. And the original idea was to build economic and monetary union and political union. Please remember that in the Maastricht we had two intergovernmental conferences running in parallel. One to build economic and monetary union, which succeeded remarkably well, I would say, and the other to promote political union, which failed and failed miserably. So in order to now complete the unfinished business of economic and monetary union, we do need, again, the driving force, the motor for integration, for deeper integration. And that motor can be provided only by France and Germany. And unless we have some sort of, say, accommodation, some sort of understanding between France and Germany, because now we have a rift, it will be very, very difficult just to forge ahead for a full fiscal union, full-fledged fiscal union, political union, economic and banking union. And so my question is, how to persuade France to become a little bit more willing to transfer sovereignty to the supranational institutions, which is something which refuses to do steadfastly, and how to persuade Germany to pay the economic price of economic and monetary union in terms of making the union a bit of transfer union. So that's to me, that's the real challenge. I take a bit of reductionist view, but I think that this is essential if we want somehow to unlock the process, just to have Franco-German axis working as the driving force for integration.
Are there any more questions? Perhaps do you mind if I take 2, 3 more and then we answer all of them? Okay, the lady here.
Hello, I'm Victoria Soteriadou from the Ministry of Finance. A couple of days ago, there was this article in the Financial Times arguing that there is discussion going on a quantitative easing in the Eurozone by the European Central Bank of the amount of 500 billion. The argument there was that, of course, there is a quantitative easing, which is, in other terms, printing new money to buy public debts. So there has been this policy in the United States since the crisis started, and it has been also at the United Kingdom since 2009, I think. So these are the two countries that have been stated here, and figures show it, that these two countries have done very well when it comes to, much better than the Eurozone when it comes to economic performance, unemployment rates, and everything else. So the argument and the question here is, if at the end of the day it is being agreed to have this quantitative easing in the Eurozone for 500 billion, while the total debt of the European Union is around 9 trillions, whether this would be enough to have any effects at all. I wonder what the panel thinks about that. Thank you.
Good evening. It's interesting that as soon as the topic of trust came up, everyone jumped on it. And this seems to be at the core of the issue, that what's lacking at this point is credible commitment, whether at the member state level between the political parties about what should we do now that there is a financial crisis, or whether it's at the supranational level with the European Union trying to dictate terms but can't really agree to something that's going to last past one government. What can we do in order to ease not only the financial crisis, but taking it one step back, what can we do to get over this crisis of confidence in political institutions? It's something that the Eurobarometer surveys have been showing, that over the past few years, individuals, citizens of member states have been trusting European Union institutions more than they've been trusting their national institutions to a large degree. But this trust is slowly whittling away through the crisis. So my question would be, what can we do in order to get back the confidence that's been lost, to start making credible commitments, especially in light of the impending presidential election and failing that, parliamentary elections in Greece. Should this occur, is there the capability to start making credible commitments to and with the European partners? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Elena Lazar. I'm currently a visiting fellow with Eliamet. I normally work in the university in Rio de Janeiro. I'm afraid my question will also fall into the pool of trust and public opinion questions, but it's a short one. It's to David Reda. You mentioned your research on public opinion support for fiscal redistribution and how it's hard to achieve that. But my question is, isn't it more of a chicken and egg question? Isn't the problem that there is actually not really supranational political consensus that this is the way to go about things? I mean, there are steps towards that, but there doesn't seem to be one unified discourse of political elites that this is the way to go. And were it that way, wouldn't the right mechanisms be put into place so that the discourse in all member states would be similar and so public opinion would perhaps be reversed? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanas Petralias, Athens University of Economics and Business. Looking also at the title of the conference and hearing about the questions about the trust and the rise of Euroscepticism and stuff like that. Do we see here, are we witnessing the transformation of the financial and the debt crisis to a social crisis and political crisis? And if this is so, which may be very dangerous, what are the tools at hand to address this threat? So
Oh, Günther, you're the first. I'm sorry about this.
Thank you for giving me the chance to be very brief, because some others are following me, and I have no answer to all the questions, which are really the true important questions. And to the first comment about the observations that we had before the crisis, we had a real important realms. We had a conversion process to some extent, that is true. And then after the crisis, everything seems to break down. My comment is to some extent, one important reason for this divergence we had after the crisis is the fact that we have very different developments in terms of the welfare state as in its function of being a stabilizer. If you look, for instance, at the so-called Okun coefficient, which is the relationship between growth and unemployment, especially youth unemployment, you see that the countries who have a developed welfare state and a very well developed education system at the level between secondary school and between tertiary schools, they did very well. So there was almost no elasticity in terms of falling GDP and increasing youth unemployment. But there are countries, especially Spain and also Greece, I think, where you did not have this kind of automatic stabilizers. And building up capacities in terms of automatic stabilizers, which are to some extent, to a large extent related to the welfare state institutions, is an important element for the future of building up a European social union. And then there was mentioned that capital flows to the south were really not sustainable investments. There were huge capital flows to the south. And I remember one of the famous German economists, Hans Werner Sinn, he was claiming that this most of these capital investments were really not sustainable because they were investments in the housing, producing a housing bubbles and maybe in meaningless infrastructure. The way the question is how to ensure that these capital flows get into sustainable investments. It's a big question. I have no short answer at the moment. But one answer is, I think, what I mentioned in my presentation, it is quite important that the taxing power has to be decentralized to a regional level and municipal level, that the accountability of investments get a broader democratic basis. That's a very general answer, but I think this is very important to channeling capital flows into real sustainable investments. For instance, in education, I agree fully. Youth program investing in people was something I had on my program, on my slides, which I didn't mention. It's extremely important. The question only is that how and in which direction. I'm definitely the opinion that we need not so much more investment into tertiary education, but more on the middle level. Most countries having tremendous youth unemployment, both in terms of unemployment rate as well as in terms of need rate, not in education and training. They have at the middle level of training almost no institutional basis. And so we have to invest into these capacities. I leave the other more difficult questions to the other colleagues. So.
Well, let me first connect to that effectiveness of a policy in the south and the capital flows. I would say that the ECB hasn't done its homework right at that period. It should have been paying more attention to the potential of those problems. And I think that is an example to some extent of regulatory capture. So why would we trust them now? That brings me to your point with quantitative easing. I think it's much better. We don't know what quantitative easing will do apart from that it will stimulate the value of equities like it did in the US and in the UK in particular. And it might be much more effective if they buy investment bonds to support that kind of investment, maybe by buying bonds from banks who invest in that, or buying these bonds directly and then put 500 billion into that kind of things. That might not be only infrastructure, but then also training. But what went wrong there is not a government problem, it's a market problem. Bubbles are primarily a market problem, and then they are not captured, they're not regulated in the right way. I think that's one of the things that we have learned. So I don't put much trust in the European Central Bank in that respect, that quantitative easing would help us. And generally, I'm a bit amazed. So in the 1970s, there was Friedman's idea about the natural rate of unemployment, and that was then caught on by the central banks and led to an entirely different view on how the economy and the labor market are working. And can we now be led again by central banks in the respect of inequality? So Janet Yellen has very valuable ideas about that. But that's not a policy maker who has been elected in a democratic process, and the same holds for the European Central Bank. So we should expect that kind of discourse from policymakers, from people who can be taken, can be accountable for what they do in that respect. So, and then I think that brings us to trust. Maybe trust is a bit like football, so we all have an opinion about it. But in my view, trust is not primarily an issue of the model, but of content, of the discourse. So I think there's a wrong discourse, and we need a discussion about that. And then from that there will be certain model changes flowing, and that's what I think might explain the observation that there's less trust in national governments than at the European level, but because there is a different discourse. They're trying to change the model there of social security, of education, which might make the wealth distribution much more important. If you have to fully finance your educational career yourself, well then the wealth distribution will become much more salient than before. So I think it's more about the content. So I think there was a lot of trust in the EU. They have stimulated equal treatment of women. They have abandoned the discrimination by working time for part-time workers, which is blossoming in the US. They don't understand what you're talking about if you're talking about equal treatment of part-time workers. There is the end of age discrimination that they're after. All these things I think are very important things which have to do with content and came from the same model. I think, well, now at the national level and at the international level, the discourse is much more about government downsizing than about government improvement and improvement of the way it functions and the way it provides for social security, education, all these other things. So I think we really need a different content more than a model, and the model might flow from that. But not the other way around. A different model will not automatically lead to a different discourse.
Right, very quickly, because time is flying by. First of all, Vasilis Monastriotis, I absolutely agree with what you said. That was the story until very recently, and I hope that it will resume at some time. Abigail's, I also agree. And actually, this was the thinking in the European Union as well. This famous 6 billion that were supposed to be given to education, training, or anything like this, this was the main idea behind all this thing. There are two things there. Was it sufficient, this amount of money? Most probably not. Everybody knew that. Was it fresh money? No, it was not. However, there is something there that may appear a bit paradoxical. The crisis may have made the financing of such projects more easily acceptable. And the reason is not a very good one. It is brain drain. If I know that you will migrate to my country perhaps later on, I may be more willing to invest on you than if you were to stay in your own country. Vicky Sotiriadou question, 500 billion sufficient? I really don't know what the answer is there. However, we must take into account two factors, one positive, one negative. The negative factor is that even this 500 billion is something that it contravenes the treaty of the ECB. And I'm very much afraid that this will be challenged in the courts. And I do not know what will happen, even though this is a perfectly normal function of any central bank in the world. Whether it is sufficient or not, perhaps it may be a good idea to look at two other central banks that did similar policies recently. One is the Bank of England, and the second one is the Fed. And see, let's say, what sort of the kind of quantitative easing vis-à-vis the debt of the corresponding countries, what size was there? This will give you an indicative answer, assuming that the problems were similar. Finally, on the question of Thanasis Petralias there, the social crisis was already there. The crisis of the welfare state is not something that came because of the crisis. It is this famous thing that Angela Merkel has said, that we are 5% of the world population, we are producing 25% of world GDP, and we are spending 50% of the total welfare spending of the entire world. Now, taking into account this problem that I mentioned before, and I think that at some time we must start thinking more seriously about it, crisis or no crisis now. We are living in aging societies. We haven't seen the consequences yet. Baby boomers are just retiring relatively recently. Yes, I'm coming to this point soon. Therefore, this is something that will put even more strain to the entire system, and I'm not really sure that in several countries there is serious discussion about it so far. Thank you.
So I think my colleagues have done a very good job of answering most of the questions. I'll just sort of add two thoughts. One, about the trust issue. I'm not sure the trust issue is a credible commitment issue. That would assume that there is a sort of a shared set of objectives or goals that then sort of everyone would in principle agree with, and then there is an issue with credible commitment if you provide sort of the institutions that help that. I'm not sure that's the case. I'm reminded of again, sort of going back to this idea of corporatism, or sort of how this redistributive Northern European societies were created. I'm reminded of Peter Katzenstein's sort of work on the emergence of corporatism, small states in war markets. And there is this underlying argument about the existence of this kind of we're all in this together ideology or philosophy or identity. I'm not sure whether we have that in this case, and I'm not sure whether, again, sort of going also to the other question about the supranational, whether sort of institutions create that, or it is that kind of identity that creates the institutions. I have no doubt about sort of the influence of the supranational and so far the absence of some sort of rhetoric from leaders that would promote the kind of issues that we've been talking about. But I just want to, and I have no doubt that if that was to exist, that would make a difference. Although, again, whether these issues are bottom-up or top-down, or whether they are a combination of bottom-up demand from the public and then top-down elite-driven as well, I'm not entirely sure. But just to clarify that what my research does in terms of population homogeneity and population heterogeneity is to show that whether you look at population heterogeneity as immigration or ethnic diversity, that there certainly is this tendency that the rich are much more likely to support redistribution in homogeneous countries. And this is perhaps sort of a depressing sort of finding, in the sense that we do have this increasing heterogeneity in many of the countries that we're talking about. But there is a positive side to this research, and sort of I'll finish with that, which is sort of the one optimistic thing that I have to say, which is that actually the poor are not affected by heterogeneity at all in their support for redistribution. So that I find, using European social survey data, and in a way that I think is very convincing, I find no support at all for this idea that the poor become welfare chauvinists and that they rather sort of shoot themselves in the foot and not support redistribution that they benefit from because they dislike others. No, they're actually consistently and homogeneously for redistribution. It's all about heterogeneity among the rich. They are affected by heterogeneity, but it is certainly the case that the poor support redistribution very uniformly.
If I may, perhaps one or two comments in response to the questions. First of all, Vasily, if I may be very provocative, if you define Bulgaria and Latvia as successful cases, I wonder how you define failure. I mean, these are countries that have lost between 10 and 20% of their population through immigration. These are countries in Latvia that has lost 25% of its GDP in 2 years. Okay, Latvia has become a member of the euro, and Bulgaria is pegged to the euro. Is that the main criterion of success? But I know it's unfair because I've been provocative and I don't give you the chance to answer back. Second point, trust in national institutions and European institutions. Of course, it is true that trust in national institutions and national politicians has registered a huge decline in most European countries, but still there is a difference. In the South, at least the data that I've seen, trust in European institutions is higher than trust in national institutions, because the political systems of the South have imploded. In the North, trust in national institutions is higher than trust in European institutions, and that creates a further problem. And my last comment perhaps is about European discourse. One of my favorite themes for years has been that the key question facing Europe is not whether we have more or less Europe, but what kind of Europe we have. And this is really where we have failed in our political discussion, and this is where our European political parties have failed in producing different kinds of discourse about the kind of Europe that they want. But this is again a very long discussion. We've come to the end, so let me first of all thank you all for your active participation. Of course, thank you to our panelists, especially those who have done a double act. Thank you very much indeed. And last but not least, I should like to thank those who've made all this thing possible, and this does not include me. So let me thank Dimitris Katsikas, who is the head of the Crisis Observatory, Kyriakos Filinis, and the young men and women who have made all this affair possible today. Thank you and good night.